Hello everyone and welcome to my Y&R Trends channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The gentle hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the roaring tempest of disbelief and betrayal that churned within Nate Hastings. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his luxurious penthouse apartment, a space that symbolized everything he had worked for, everything he had achieved through meticulous planning, unwavering discipline, and a fierce dedication to his principles. The glittering skyline of Genoa city sprawled out before him, a tapestry of ambition and secrets, but today it felt like a taunt. Every light in every window seemed to whisper the same single impossible sentence that had shattered his world. Audra's claim that she was pregnant, and that he, Nate, was the father. His mind, a sharp instrument honed by years of medical training and corporate strategizing, rejected the premise with every fiber of his being. It wasn't a simple denial born of fear or responsibility, but a deep, visceral, almost clinical certainty that the timeline, the circumstances, the very nature of their final tumultuous encounters, made such an outcome a statistical and practical improbability bordering on the fantastical. He replayed those last weeks with Audra in his head on a relentless loop, a torturous filmstrip of heated arguments, cold silences, and a growing chasm of mistrust that had made intimacy feel like a distant foreign country they had both left behind. The dates didn't align, the moments of connection were too few and far between, and the shadow of her ambition, so similar to his own yet so dangerously unmoored from his ethical code, had loomed too large for any genuine, procreative intimacy to have occurred. He remembered the exact moment she had told him, her voice a carefully modulated blend of vulnerability and steel, her eyes searching his for a reaction he was determined not to give. He had offered support, of course, the kind of detached, professional concern one might offer a colleague in distress, but he had not offered belief. He had not embraced her. He had not felt the surge of paternal joy or even panic that such news should, by all accounts, provoke. Instead, a cold, hard knot of suspicion had formed in his gut, a diagnostician's intuition that the symptoms did not match the purported disease. He saw the way her gaze sometimes drifted past him, calculating, assessing, as if she were measuring the potential yield of this newfound leverage. He recalled her past maneuvers, the way she could wield information and personal connection as weapons in the high-stakes game of corporate power they were both playing. A pregnancy, his child, would be the ultimate trump card, a permanent tether to the Hastings family fortune and influence, a guarantee of a seat at a table she was desperate to claim. The thought was so cynical, so profoundly dark, that he almost felt guilty for entertaining it, but Nate was a realist above all else. He had seen the lengths to which people in this town would go for a fraction of what he represented, and he would not allow himself to be manipulated in such a fundamental, life-altering way. His entire identity was built on control of his career, his image, his destiny. To lose that control, to have the course of his life determined by a potential deception, was an existential threat he could not abide. This conviction, however, existed in a vacuum, a silent scream in a soundproof room. To voice it aloud to his family, to Elena, to anyone who knew Audra, was to risk being seen as a monster, a man so callous he would deny his own child to avoid responsibility. He could already hear the whispers. Nate's changed. Power has corrupted him. He's abandoning the mother of his child. The court of public opinion in Genoa City was swift and merciless, and the Hastings name, while powerful, was not immune to scandal. He felt the weight of his Uncle Devon's expectations, the quiet disappointment in his grandmother Mamie's eyes whenever family discord arose, and the fragile, newly repaired bond with Elena, which felt like it could shatter again under the slightest pressure. He was trapped, cornered by a narrative he knew in his soul to be false, yet one he had no tangible evidence to disprove. The need for proof became an obsession, a singular focus that cut through the fog of doubt and anger. It was the only way to reclaim his narrative, to protect his future, and to expose what he believed was a devastating falsehood. The solution, in its brutal modern simplicity, was a paternity test. But broaching the subject was a diplomatic minefield. How does one ask the woman carrying what she claims is your child to prove it, without sounding like the villain she was perhaps hoping to paint him as? The confrontation was inevitable, a storm gathering on the horizon, and he knew he had to be the one to weather its first furious blast. When he finally did broach the subject, the atmosphere in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric current of unspoken accusations and wounded pride. He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon making a first incision, careful, deliberate, aiming for clinical detachment but knowing the cut would be felt deeply. Audra, he had begun, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. Given the complicated nature of our relationship at the time you believe this child was conceived, and for the absolute clarity and security of everyone involved, especially this child, I think it's imperative that we establish paternity through a DNA test. He watched the words land, saw the subtle shift in her expression. A flicker of something hard and furious behind the mask of maternal innocence she had so carefully constructed. It wasn't surprise he saw, but a calculated reassessment of her strategy. Her reaction was a masterclass in controlled outrage, a performance designed to make him feel cruel and unreasonable. She spoke of trust, of the sacred bond they had once shared, of the insult this request posed not just to her, but to the very idea of the child they were supposed to be creating together. She wielded her pregnancy like a shield, deflecting his logical request with emotional appeals that were designed to make him second-guess his own convictions. But Nate stood his ground, his resolve hardening with every tear she shed, every accusation she hurled. To him the tears seemed like a tool, the anger a tactic. He saw the chessboard clearly, and he knew that this move, the demand for a test, was the only way to check her king. After a protracted, emotionally draining battle of wills, a battle fought in hushed, intense tones in his apartment and through terse, coded text messages, she finally reluctantly agreed. Her acquiescence felt less like a surrender and more like a strategic retreat, and that alone deepened his suspicion. The days that followed the collection of the DNA samples were an exercise in agonizing suspense. The world continued to turn, business at Chancellor Winters demanded his attention, family dinners required his presence, and through it all, Nate carried the secret of the pending results like a lead weight strapped to his soul. Every phone notification made his pulse jump. Every call from an unknown number sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He played out every possible scenario in his mind. What if he was wrong? What if, against all odds and his own steadfast certainty, the child was his? The prospect filled him with a complex dread, not of fatherhood itself, for he had often imagined a family someday with the right person under the right circumstances, but of a lifetime inextricably linked to a woman he no longer trusted, a partnership born not of love or even mutual respect, but of deception and strategic maneuvering. It would be a gilded cage, a future dictated by a single fateful mistake. Conversely, the thought of the test confirming his doubts brought its own unique brand of turmoil. It would mean Audra had indeed attempted to perpetrate a fraud of the most intimate and profound kind. It would mean a confrontation of nuclear proportions, a scandal that would ripple through both their professional and personal lives, and the undeniable proof that the woman he had once cared for was capable of a breathtaking level of manipulation. He found himself stealing glances at her during chance encounters at society, noting the subtle curve of her abdomen, the way she would sometimes place a protective hand there, and he would wrestle with a confusing mix of anger, pity, and a stubborn, lingering doubt that maybe, just maybe, he was the one who was monstrously mistaken. The call, when it finally came, was not from a lab technician but from his own private lawyer, a discreet and unflappable man named Arthur Collins, who had handled the entire matter with the utmost confidentiality. Nate had taken the call in his office, the door locked, the world outside muted. Arthur's voice was, as always, calm and measured, but there was an undercurrent of gravity that Nate immediately detected. "Nate," Arthur began, "the results are in. I have the sealed envelope here." Nate's throat went dry. The moment of truth, the moment that would irrevocably define his future, was contained within a simple manila envelope sitting in his lawyer's briefcase. He instructed Arthur to bring it to him immediately, not trusting the information to a courier or a digital scan. The 20 minutes it took for Arthur to arrive felt like 20 hours. Nate paced the length of his office, his mind a terrifying blank, all his carefully constructed scenarios collapsing into a single, overwhelming point of now. When Arthur arrived, he placed the envelope on the desk between them, a silent, ominous object. Nate thanked him, asked him to wait outside, and then he was alone with the truth. He stared at the envelope, his name printed neatly on the front, the logo of the laboratory a bland official stamp of authenticity. His hands, usually so steady during delicate surgical procedures and high-pressure board meetings, trembled slightly as he picked it up. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient in his lungs, and then with a decisive tear, he ripped it open. His eyes scanned the document, skipping the legalese and the technical jargon, going straight for the only line that mattered, the conclusion that would dictate the next chapter of his life. The words were stark, unambiguous, and printed in a cold, impersonal font. Probability of paternity, 0%. He read it once, then again, a third time. The zero seemed to pulse on the page, a void and absolute negation. There was no ambiguity, no room for error, no shadow of a doubt. The child Audra was carrying was not his. The air rushed from his lungs in a great whooshing exhale he didn't realize he'd been holding. A wave of pure, unadulterated vindication washed over him, so powerful it left him lightheaded. He had been right. His instincts, his logic, his deep-seated certainty, all of it had been correct. He wasn't the monster. He was the victim of an elaborate, cruel deception. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks evaporated, replaced by a white-hot surge of fury. It was a clean, sharp anger, devoid of the confusing fog of guilt that had plagued him before. She had lied. To his face, to his family, to everyone. She had attempted to chain him to a life built on a fundamental lie, to use an innocent child as a pawn in her game of power and acquisition. The sheer audacity of it, the cold-blooded calculation, was staggering. But as the initial triumphant wave of vindication began to recede, it revealed a more complex shoreline of emotions beneath. There was a profound sense of violation, a feeling that the most intimate parts of his life, his body, his lineage, his future, had been trespassed upon. And then a darker, more chilling thought began to take shape. If the child wasn't his, then whose was it? Audra had been so adamant, so specific in her claim against him. For her to be that confident, she must have been equally certain that no other potential father could emerge to contradict her story. What did that mean? Had she been so isolated, so singularly focused on him as her target, that there was no other man in the picture? Or, more disturbingly, was there another man? And her targeting of Nate was so premeditated that she had eliminated the other possibility through some other means? The questions swirled, dark and unsettling. He thought of the men in her orbit, Evan, Tucker, even some of the other executives she interacted with. Had she been involved with someone else concurrently? Was this a desperate attempt to cover up another relationship that had gone wrong? Or was this, from the very beginning, a targeted, malicious plan aimed squarely at him and the Hastings Empire? The DNA results were not an end, but a beginning. They were the key that had unlocked the first door, only to reveal a long, dark corridor lined with even more disturbing possibilities. He had the truth, but he now needed the whole story. He needed to understand the why, the how, and most importantly, the who else. Folding the document with deliberate, controlled movements, he placed it carefully back into the envelope. The time for speculation was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. He knew that simply presenting her with the results would not be the end of it. A woman capable of a lie this significant would have a contingency plan. A story ready to explain away the scientific facts. She might claim the test was flawed, that there had been a mix-up at the lab, or she might simply break down and retreat behind a wall of denial and victimhood. He had to be prepared for anything. He needed witnesses, a context where her reaction could be observed and her lies could be dismantled in real time. He decided then that he would not do this alone. He would bring this to his family, not in a public setting, but in the relative privacy and security of the Chancellor Winter's mansion, a place that represented the very legacy she had sought to infiltrate. He needed Devon's calm rationality, Lily's sharp intuition, and the collective strength of his family unit to face the fallout. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, the DNA results feeling like a live wire in his breast pocket. He was about to detonate a bomb at the very center of his life, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of purpose, a clear and righteous path forward. He was no longer the accused, waiting for a verdict. He was the accuser, armed with irrefutable evidence, and he was ready to watch the house of cards she had built come tumbling down. The shock of the DNA results was now his weapon, and he was prepared to wield it, not with malice, but with a fierce and unyielding demand for the truth, no matter how ugly or shocking it might ultimately prove to be. The game was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous and revealing round was only just beginning, and Nate, fortified by the cold, hard facts in his possession, was ready to play to win. The revelation would send ripples through the very foundations of Genoa City, exposing not just a single lie, but the intricate web of ambition and deceit that lay beneath its glittering surface, a web in which Audra was both spider and fly, and Nate was now the one holding the light. The world of Genoa City has never been a place for calm hearts or steady lives. And in recent months, the turmoil surrounding Nate Hastings and Audra Charles has only deepened. Their relationship was never built on trust but rather on ambition, secrecy, and a dangerous attraction that pulled them together at the wrong moments. Now, with Audra's shocking announcement that she is pregnant, everything has been pushed to the edge. For Nate, the news was less than joyous. It was an explosion of confusion and suspicion. In his heart, he could not accept the possibility so easily. He knew Audra, he knew her games, and he could not help but believe this so-called pregnancy was just another manipulation. But in true Genoa City fashion, the truth would not remain buried forever, and the DNA results that followed promised to shake every alliance, every love, and every fragile truce that stood in their world. From the moment Audra uttered the words, "I'm pregnant and it's your child," Nate felt his chest tighten. He tried to mask his reaction with calmness, but his sharp eyes betrayed him. Audra, always the cunning strategist, noticed his hesitation instantly. She leaned into the moment with all the confidence of a woman who knew how to weaponize emotion. But Nate, though tempted by the pull of her gaze, could not erase his doubts. He had been down this road of lies before with other people, and Audra was not exactly the epitome of honesty. If anything, she thrived on schemes and deception. So why should this moment be any different? His mind raced, questioning every recent encounter, every word she had spoken, and every calculated glance she had given. Audra, sensing his disbelief, turned defensive. She accused him of minimizing her feelings, of doubting her integrity as if she were nothing more than a reckless opportunist. Yet the more she protested, the less convinced Nate became. Something about her tone carried a rehearsed quality, as if she had prepared for this battle long before she dropped her so-called bombshell. It wasn't just about the pregnancy, it was about control. And Nate knew better than to surrender his life to a narrative he didn't fully believe. In private, Nate replayed the last few weeks. He thought about how their physical connection, though passionate, often felt like a power play more than a true partnership. He thought about her entanglements with others, the whispers he had overheard, and the subtle hints that she always seemed to be keeping secrets. Audra was a master of half-truths, and Nate questioned whether she could even distinguish between her own lies and reality anymore. For him, the timing of this pregnancy seemed too convenient, especially now when his career and relationships were already on fragile ground. A child would tie him to Audra permanently, and that was something he wasn't ready to accept, not without proof. When word of Audra's claim began to leak, whispers in Genoa City grew louder. Elena, still nursing old wounds from Nate's betrayals, couldn't resist her own commentary. She suspected that Audra's motives were less about love and more about trapping Nate in a web he could never escape. Devon, too, raised an eyebrow, his distrust of Audra resurfacing instantly. Even Victoria, who had once seen Audra as a loyal protégé, questioned whether this was just another move in Audra's long chess game. The pregnancy wasn't just personal. It had the potential to ripple through Newman Enterprises and beyond. For Audra, this was power. For Nate, it was a threat to his freedom. As the days passed, Audra grew more insistent. She talked about prenatal care, about the future, about what kind of father Nate would be. She painted elaborate pictures of family life, trying to anchor him in her story. But Nate couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too scripted. He finally demanded proof, not just words, not just emotion, but science. A DNA test. The moment he brought it up, Audra's demeanor shifted. Her confident exterior cracked, if only for a second, and Nate saw it. It was all the confirmation he needed that his instincts weren't wrong. Audra tried to delay, offering excuses about timing and privacy, but Nate refused to back down. He knew that the only way to reclaim control over the situation was to face it head-on, with irrefutable results. Behind her smile, Audra panicked. If the DNA results revealed the truth, Everything she had worked for would collapse. But she couldn't backtrack now, not when so much was at stake. The test was arranged quietly, with Nate making sure no one but the two of them knew at first. He wanted answers before the rest of Genoa City sunk its claws into the drama. When the samples were taken, the tension between them was electric. Audra tried to act calm, but Nate noticed the way her hands fidgeted, the way her eyes darted nervously when the nurse left the room. He kept his silence, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a debate. This was no longer about words, it was about the truth, and soon enough, the results would speak louder than anything either of them could say. The waiting period was excruciating. Nate buried himself in work, trying to focus on tasks that distracted him from the looming storm. But no matter how hard he tried, the thought lingered. What if she wasn't lying? What if the child truly was his? The very idea terrified him. A child meant responsibility, permanence, and a connection to Audra that could never be severed. And though Nate wasn't against the idea of fatherhood, he knew he couldn't take on that role with someone he didn't trust. He wanted stability, honesty, and a sense of safety for any child he brought into the world. With Audra, none of that was guaranteed. Meanwhile, Audra spun her version of the story to others, dropping hints to allies and potential enemies alike that she and Nate were about to embark on a new chapter. She thrived on the attention, letting people wonder, speculate, and spread the news. But beneath her veneer of confidence, her nerves frayed with each passing day. She feared what would come once the DNA results arrived, but she also believed she could twist the outcome to her advantage, no matter what the truth said. After all, manipulation was her specialty, and she was determined not to lose the upper hand. When the envelope finally arrived, the air seemed heavier, charged with an invisible energy that neither Nate nor Audra could ignore. They sat in silence as Nate tore it open, his hands steady but his heart racing. The words on the page stared back at him, shocking, undeniable, and life-changing. The results didn't align with Audra's story. They didn't confirm what she had so passionately sworn was the truth. Instead, they revealed something Audra hadn't anticipated. Nate wasn't the father.